more on the UN investigation to Israel's attack on Gaza-bound Flotilla. I'm now joined by Hillel Neuer, the executive director of the UN Watch. Mr. Neuer, thank you for being with us here in the program. Now, as we know, Israel slammed a previous UN report, calling it biased and distorted. How much more likely do you think it's to accept the findings of this human rights abuse investigation?
Well, look, this report was determined in advance. The Human Rights Council held an emergency session only a day or two after the flotilla incident happened. They declared Israel guilty of, quote, an outrageous attack. So the outcome was entirely predetermined. And this is not something that's exceptional. In fact, Mary Robertson, who was the UN rights chief, said that the Human Rights Council has a pattern of acting politically and not for human rights. Let's remember who the membership is. Saudi Arabia, China. Colonel Gaddafi of Libya is now a member of the Human Rights Council. This is not a body that cares about human rights. This is a body that is political, that is engaged in a constant campaign to delegitimize Israel. And human rights is the last thing on the minds of members like Saudi Arabia, Cuba, and Libya. And I think
Mr. Neuer, nine people were killed.
Selective and politicized.
Okay, 9 people were killed involving the nationals from Turkey. Why are you saying that this investigation was predetermined?
Because the Human Rights Council decided before the investigation was even set up, before the members were set up, that Israel was guilty. Who can think of a legal process where before the judge is even selected, the body that establishes the inquiry declares that one side is guilty? Now, evidence was disregarded. Our organization, UN Watch, submitted evidence regarding the jihadist statements by a number of the IHH militants, some of whom had terrorist records, including hijacking a ferry in the 1990s to support Chechen terrorists. All of this evidence was disregarded. None of the evidence, including documents that were featured on BBC's Panorama by Jane Corbin, showing the jihadist intentions. Many of the people who were killed, of the 9 people, said in advance that they wanted to be martyrs. They wanted to be shaheeds.
Well,
why was this evidence
now
entirely ignored in this report?
Okay,
that's why Kofi Annan said the Human Rights Council is selective and politicized.
Let's now take a look at these investigations more closely. So Israel's internal investigation found that Gaza raid was justified as self-defense. And now let's compare that to the UN's. How can 2 different investigations come up with such opposite conclusions?
Well, Israel's judicial inquiry has not concluded yet. There was the IDF inquiry, so we'll have to wait what Israel's judicial inquiry says. But again, the Human Rights Council, as Kofi Annan said, is selective, politicized, and casts a shadow upon the reputation of the UN as a whole. Ban Ki-moon criticized the Council for its excessive focus on Israel, which is 75% of all resolutions are against Israel, only a handful on the rest of the world combined. Out of 10 emergency sessions, 7 have been against Israel. So what happens when we get such a report that is biased, that disregarded evidence that we submitted of the IHH's jihadist intentions, their violent actions on the ship, the fact that the violence that happened, they were looking for a confrontation. All of that was disregarded. In fact, this is part of a pattern at the Human Rights Council, entirely consistent with their actions in recent years.
Okay, Hillel Neuer, thanks very much for your insight. They're Executive Director of the UN